This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, said I'm gonna let it shine.
Hi there, and thanks for listening. My name is Daniel Kringer, and this is the SkanFest podcast, an interview series for the Skaneateles Festival, a summer concert series based in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. In these talks, we are spending time getting to know our visiting artists who travel the world making music at the very top of their field. Davóne Tines is heralded as a singer of immense power and fervor, and one of the most powerful voices of our time. He is a path-breaking artist at the intersection of many histories, cultures, and aesthetics. His work blends opera, spirituals, gospel, and anthems as a means to tell a deeply personal story of perseverance and human connection. This year, he made his Met debut in John Adams El Niño and will release a newly recorded album, Robeson, and is much in demand as a stage and concert performer all over the country. Thanks so much for making the time to be here, Davóne.
Lovely to be here. Hi.
So we're going to talk about your work, both current and upcoming, which is prolific. But I'd like to talk a little bit starting out just by asking you about how things began for you. So can you tell me about your background and particularly how you got started in music?
Yeah, I am from rural Northern Virginia, about an hour and a half southwest of D.C. Orlean, Virginia, which is a tiny town near Manassas where there was a battle that some people know about.
Yes, I do recognize that.
But out in the countryside there. And my singing actually began in my family's church, which is just 5 minutes down the road from where I grew up, a little church called Providence Baptist Church, Orlean, Virginia. And singing was just something that was required from everyone in our family. You know, Saturday morning, everyone went to choir rehearsal no matter what. Mm-hmm. And whether it was youth choir or mass choir or men's choir, you know, there are just a lot of different choral singing activities to take part in. And so that was the very beginnings of my music making. Ever since I remember, being a toddler, 3, 4, just sitting in on choir rehearsals, even if I wasn't participating and rolling around on the floor, wondering when they'd be over, Mm-hmm. I mean, in our church context, rehearsals could go on anywhere from 2 to 6 hours.
Whoa.
Sometimes because, there was a lot of work to do on the music, and sometimes because choir rehearsals would turn into church services, essentially.
I see. Yeah,
if you're singing really joyous songs that are very evocative of emotion, they might turn into their own necessary experiences. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a really beautiful way to start making music. And that also was a foundation for other, I guess, types. I would say more formal, but I guess formality only makes a difference in terms of context. So different types of music making that I started to take on. First, piano lessons. Okay. When I was, in my late single digits, took lessons from a teacher down the road. And then that led to starting violin in 6th grade. Okay. So, learning, I guess, different angles of the ABCs of music making. Mm-hmm. I know even now it's funny thinking about this in retrospect because, as you get older, you start to see a picture in a different way. And thinking about the genesis of my music making, it's kind of like piano gave me the, structure of how things worked. It's a very literal incarnation of you learn scales and keys, and it becomes very clear and structured in such a useful way. Violin taught me a certain use of lyricism. Mm-hmm. It taught me a certain sense of being in a different sort of community. I loved being in orchestras. I loved falling into the orchestral repertoire. I was very obsessed with Vivaldi, of course, as a young violinist, as any young violinist is. Sure. And I now think that has definitely been a part of my professional music making. I just sang another version of John Adams El Niño with the Houston Symphony not too long ago, and a really amazing conductor, David Roberts, who I've loved collaborating with. He noted that I had a certain penchant for spot-on intonation and also lyricism that came from playing the violin for 14 years.
Interesting.
But,
so let me ask you then, tying into sort of the singing, you said you started out and you were doing the singing just kind of as like a way of life, sort of, and you picked up these other instruments. What sort of pulled you back toward singing being like a primary thing for you as you started to get older?
Totally. Slowly, it just kind of became a path of least resistance. I realized I kept getting asked or invited to do it, and it was never something I was really gunning for, I never thought of myself as a soloist when I was younger. I wanted to join choir because in our school system, you couldn't do choir and orchestra together until high school. So the moment I got to high school, I auditioned for the choir and got into that, which led to doing musicals. And I kept getting the lead in the musical, even though that wasn't, it was fun to try out for it, but it still wasn't completely like I was gunning for it, but it was a lot of fun, and I just realized I had a bit of a natural talent for it. And then I thought I might go to school for singing. Maybe I'd go to college for it. I auditioned for different conservatories, but my family wanted me to go to college that would lead to a job with a desk.
Oh, yeah. Dependability, reliability.
Completely, And so I thought, okay, if you want me to do that, I don't know. I guess this isn't a way of rebelling, but I thought I would do that as hard as possible. So I got into Harvard. And I said, okay, I'll get a huge desk now. But I ended up studying in the music department, which back then was mainly theory and pedagogy. It's opened up quite a lot over the past, 20 years even. But that didn't fulfill all of my musical interests. I really was more interested in performing. Part of it is there are so many different ensembles that you can take part in. I was in the orchestra. I was president of the orchestra, which is a 200-plus-year-old organization, in the Harvard Radcliffe Collegium Musicum, which is a Renaissance polyphony choir. There are 2 different undergraduate opera companies. So there's a lot of really well-led student work. But I decided actually to not completely study in music and to move into sociology. Oh, okay. Because I wanted to, I thought, how does this lead to some sort of career? And I didn't, I wasn't imagining I'd ever be a musical soloist or have this as a career, but arts administration seemed like something that was attainable. Yep. And sociology, more than business or economics even, seemed like a way to get there because I became really fascinated with why culture creates and propagates and supports art making. So I thought if I could understand that at kind of a socio-theoretical level, I could understand how to actually administrate it in the world in a healthy way.
Yeah, we will tie back into your time at Harvard and some of the projects that you did while you were there, along these lines you're talking about.
Sure.
But let me ask you just a few sort of incidental questions, which are kind of fun, which is tying back to the singing stuff. Are there singers, contemporary or past, that inspire you, that you enjoy listening to?
I guess a maybe obvious answer that I've gotten to in an inobvious way over time has been Paul Robeson.
Yep.
Being a Black classical singer who did a broad array of things, a Renaissance man in his own right. I was very, inspired and curious about him, and he's continued to be someone I've investigated in a way. But then there are other singers, some of the earliest albums I had were Lauryn Hill and Mary J. Blige, people of a contemporary soul and an R&B, tradition, and learning about broader aesthetics that way. But in terms of solo singers, I think I've just had a very broad eclecticism of trying to listen to so many different things that it wasn't about emulating any one person.
Okay, lovely. So tying into sort of the art form, which you sort of referenced to projects with conductors and sort of leading into the singing solo and all that sort of stuff, what sort of makes this art form meaningful to you? What kind of pulls you to keep creating and contributing to it?
I really appreciate that it is about communicating very directly with audiences. There was kind of an important shift for me from middle school to high school when, while playing the violin, I would learn my music as quickly as possible. And I was really fastidious, and I was concertmaster of most orchestras that I was in, when I was younger. And I would memorize my music because I was more interested in seeing how the audience reacted to things.
Wow.
When we'd play things that were fast and loud or play things that were really beautiful, I really wanted to just watch the audience watch the concert. And then singing was a really amazing shift because, it took the instrument out of my hand and turned me directly to the audience.
Yeah.
So I could have a really clear, ongoing, exchange and always be feeling the interaction of what's being communicated and how is it being received.
Sure.
And so I think that's why I've stuck with singing, because it's been the most energizing, because I realize I do kind of crave that channel of communication.
Was there a moment or like a person who helped you decide that this was something you wanted to do as a vocation? Some people, when I talk to them, are they're on either side of the fence. Yes, there's something specific, or it's a cumulative sort of experience.
I think it really was cumulative, but there have been people along the way that have been kind of, clear parts of the inspiration.
Yeah.
Some of those were Patricia Miller, who is a soprano, who now leads the voice program at George Mason University. So in my freelance work after Harvard, I was production manager for the George Mason University opera program, and and also did stage management and other things. And she was the head of that program, so I started taking lessons from her. So I, worked in the technical side, but started to take lessons, and she really started to get me to wrap my head around the idea of going to conservatory for grad school, just being kind of consistently saying, like, I think you've got something, and we can work on honing the skills to get you audition ready. And then another huge inspiration that's continued to be kind of a cornerstone that I refer back to every once in a while. I had the pleasure and privilege of working with the late Maestro Lauren Mazel towards the end of his life. He lived with his family on a farm estate about half an hour from where I grew up in Virginia. And in his move towards retirement, started the Castleton Festival, which in the last years of him being alive was this crazy full-blown festival where he built an opera house essentially in his backyard on 200 acres and invited 25 young singers and a full orchestra to just live in all the houses on this huge property and just put on operas. There were lots of formal young artist program, and this was as opposite from that as it could be. But we had a lot of exposure to things that we normally wouldn't have. I got
so
to
much, I'm sure.
Completely, but like crazy opportunities. Like I sang in a Verdi opera, when I was 22, which is just crazy. And also opportunities just to sing and work with one of the older masters of that sort of work. It really showed me, there are people that are kind of wizards at this or masterful in a certain way. And there was a moment when we would give tiny recitals, or we'd all sing on different groups of recitals, and after one of them, he very distinctly is very distinguished older man who was very very specific and deliberate in everything he did, and he looked at me and he said, "You have what it takes to do this." And at that point, that meant the world to me. It really just made that cornerstone of my confidence, knowing that no matter what, this person I deeply respect says that I can do this.
Yeah. Wonderful. So let's start getting into the sort of career stuff, right? You're a performer, but you are also a creator, and you spend time, making new things, updating and adapting others' creations into something new. Where do you find inspiration for that? What sort of like plants the seed?
Yeah,
ideas?
I think it's come from the unique road into classical singing that I've had.
Mm.
It was never through the standard path of, conservatory onto various programs with opera houses, which I now realize is almost like a conveyor belt or like a factory assembly line, where in an interesting turn of how things in the 20th century or early and mid 20th century, and even through the earlier industrialization of now this is the sociologist in me coming out.
Go on.
But when things turned in America and generally in the world into mechanized means of production, there's this weird synchronicity with how that happened in the arts as well. Things became very kind of organized and institutionalized, and the functions of people became very codified. And so training to be a singer, or at least I found when I went to Juilliard after studying sociology, was kind of like being being conscripted into a trade school. You're being taught certain skills in order to be a cog in a machine. And that machine hopefully has the best, intents and values, but not always, because maybe the purpose of the intent of that institution, but also the attention given to individuals, is not exactly cared for in a communal sense. So I say all that to say, when I came into being a performing artist more fully, I came into it always looking at the broader picture of the context in which I was singing. How does the organization exist? How is the work, the produce of the organization actually meeting any sort of mission statement or values that it outputs? And what does it mean for me as a specific individual to be offering my life, my energy, in order to, help or be a part of this larger machine? So when you ask, like, where did the seed come from? I think it just comes from having this dogged, inescapable lens of trying to understand, like, how things work, why things work.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to spend any bit of my life energy being a part of it, what is the healthy interaction in that way for myself and my colleagues?
Sure, very much a continuity sort of, right?
Yeah.
So talking about singing a little bit more, so the voice is a very unique instrument. It's actually literally part of us, right?
Yeah.
And it's affected by everything from like illness to emotional states. Can you just share some of your thoughts on the voice as an instrument and your experience developing yours and using it?
Yeah. Life as a singer, wow, it's just it's such a crazy idea, that what we do is completely, as you say, like incarnate from our bodies and from our states in many different valences. And growing as a singer has always meant growing as a person. Whether it's from the health aspect and how am I being aware of my body in so many minute ways and in macro ways, how am I training my core so that my posture and my body is allowed to simply exist in space in a healthy way, but also, what am I doing to think about my deeper emotions and relating my own personal experiences to the very words that I'm saying, and how does that even translate itself through the physical support of that production? I always joke and say, but I mean, I find it true that, being a singer is essentially being paid to have therapy in front of people.
Wow. Yeah, I've never heard that before, but I don't see the line.
Totally. So, I mean, and further to creating and trying to be conscious of like who I am as a person while doing it, creating has only happened when I've had questions that I've wanted to answer, and using, interactions with institutions as a means to, be able to explore those questions.
So you sing in many different settings, from opera, oratorio, recital, recording. You've even created music videos as part of your collaborative and sort of creative projects. Do you have a preference, or maybe you can speak to the difference between those settings? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I've taught a couple semesters of a course at Harvard with my best friend and collaborator, Zach Winokur, who's a director and a producer. And we've made things together for over 10 years. And so we externalized our creative process into something that we hope to share with other people, whether they be performing artists or people trying to tell any sort of, or communicate any sort of message. And an important foundational tenet of that is, one, defining a purpose, saying, the purpose of this project is XYZ. And I've added the caveat, in order to help people to XYZ. So you always have to be able to answer that question. The purpose is X in order to help people to Y. Yeah. So, you have a clear direction, and it's always with the intention of being of service to people. Now, farther down that process is this funny conversation or interaction between the ideas of content and form. So without going too deep into that,
sure.
Content is maybe like, the guts of what you're trying to say, and form is how you're going to say it. And sometimes it's a chicken and the egg. One comes before the other. One, you might have an assignment that's like, you have to make a recital. Okay, that's the form. What's the content going to be? And sometimes it's like, I want to talk about this subject. Okay, so what form does that subject need? So in choosing medium, it always comes from what is the most compelling form necessary to deliver the content. And that changes, based on what the purpose is.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'd like to shift a little bit. I'd like to talk about some of the productions and whatnot you've been involved with. I'd like to talk a little bit about El Niño, Nativity Oratorio by John Adams, and your recent appearance at the Metropolitan Opera, and you're in quite a number of productions of El Niño, right? So can you talk about that and how that came about?
Yeah, that piece is just one of my favorite things. It's my favorite piece of contemporary music, and is part of the genesis of a lot of my work in getting to know Peter Sellers, who devised all of the texts for El Niño, and then his ongoing collaboration with John Adams. And John invited me to sing the bass-baritone role in El Niño around his 70th birthday, which was some time ago. And there was just kind of a John Adams festival around the world celebrating his work, and El Niño kind of toured around the world. So that was my first introduction to it, with him conducting, which was, the most fantastic way to get to know something, because of his deep love and fervor and passion for how this story, this, kind of epic story, could become very human and modern. And I've really loved delving into that work because of it. And doing it in so many different iterations has showed me, just how rich a text of music can be. So, doing it in concerts around the world in different orchestras, you get to understand it as, literal musical text, the brilliance of the rhythmic choices and harmonic choices and overall structure. But then, doing it in a different setting, which was inspired by my incredible colleague Julia Bullock, who soprano, who asked John and Peter to make a shortened version of it so that it could be a little more transferable. Because if you don't know, El Niño is just like a huge undertaking for any organization. It's an oversized orchestra. There are synthesizers and extra, brass and percussion, and there's a huge choir. There are 6 soloists, so it's the biggest sort of oratorial skill you can imagine. and it's wonderful in that way. But Julia really, initiated a version of this that's more intimate, which kind of colors the story in a different and very beautiful way. And it's both pieces are distinct enough to where they live on their own, and it's worth partaking in both ways. So, getting to know the big scale was great, but then getting to know this more intimate version, this one where it's more like chamber music with colleagues that I performed over time, is great. But then to go way the other direction and further, even beyond to stage it at the Met Opera was just an incredible experience, because talk about taking something of such scale and then blowing it up into the largest incarnation you could imagine. I mean, that production was incredible, led by Liliana Blaine Cruz, the director, who really brought her Haitian American life and experience to the work, and kind of seeing the idea of the birth of the Messiah as connected to migrant groups, especially in Central America and South America. But I also say that to say, the aesthetic of the thing took on this Haitian folk art world that is very much about layering and colors layered and vibrancy and bigness that beautifully met the scale of the music. And so it was like being lost in a coloring book, or a flip book that just kept getting larger.
Yeah, it's quite a visual experience. I recommend people listening just Google the production.
Just look up some of the pictures. Yeah. It's pretty insane.
Yeah. Great. So let's talk about Robeson. You have an album releasing this September, Robeson, and the disc jacket includes the subtitle, A Classical Americana Electro Gospel Acid Trip. Can you break that down?
Totally. Yeah. So the inspiration for the project, which we've been making for a little over 3 years now, has been my kind of allowing myself to go down the journey of understanding my actual connections to Paul Robeson. I was ascribed to be connected to him throughout my early singing career. Sure. People heard that I was a low bass baritone, and they say, you sound like Paul Robeson. Do you sing Old Man River? Yeah. And I'd say, no, I'd never heard that song before. I had never seen Showboat. I saw Showboat for the first time when I went to San Francisco Opera with the author Amy Tan, who's become a friend. And, that was a little later, I think, in my late 20s, and I said, okay, well, that's an interesting thing. But I thought Old Man River was kind of a song of oppression. It's about being weary and scared at the ongoing flow of the world. He says in the original song, I'm tired of living and scared of dying, and that didn't seem like anything I was interested in connecting to at that age, especially. But it was always kind of this specter, he was this figure that I felt I needed to contend with, and I finally got to the place of being able to explore and do that. And in exploring his biography with some of my close colleagues, we found this really unique event. Also, long story short, if people don't really know, Paul Robeson was a classical singer, and he was also many other things. A pro football player, but also a Shakespearean actor. In the West End, and an actor in Broadway as well, and a movie actor. And in his time, the 30s and 40s and early 50s, he was the most famous Black person in the world. And he used his platform to go beyond art and also engage, social issues. He was a member of the socialist movement, which led to a lot of persecution and complication with the United States government. And we found this event where he was basically on political exile in Moscow, and it's understood by his family that he attempted suicide in a hotel room in Moscow because of being poisoned on LSD by the CIA, which was a practice undertaken, with other different political, outspoken figures. And this moment of, his love and his work and his care for people, his idea of socialism was traveling around the world and showing how all cultures are connected and how all the working or disenfranchised people of the world could come together in order to, fight for equality. The fact that such noble work could lead to such a deep attack on his personage was really inspiring in that it humanized him. He had an extreme moment of vulnerability, and it connected to my own, life story and having certain vulnerabilities, as I think everyone does. I think everyone's been through, some time in life where they were really downtrodden or really confused and didn't know how they would go on, but they made the decision to go on as he did. And that's what was inspiring, and that's what connected me to him. So I wanted to make an album that, I could sing all the Paul Robeson repertoire, but in a way that felt a little more honest to my own connection. And so the album is only Robeson music, excuse me. And it it basically is the soundtrack to what might be happening in that in that bathroom. You know, it's kind of the soundtrack to the fever dream of this acid trip where someone's reviewing their life and going through the different circumstances that have led them to question their own existence to the point of maybe even ending it, but then finding within themselves the inspiration to go forward. So that allows the music to shapeshift. You know, there are things that are more standardly in the style he sang, but then there are certain opportunities to go to other sound worlds, you know, truly an acid trip.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. So could you highlight some of the song choices and some of the transformations you were talking about applying to them to sort of give it your own sort of approach? Yeah.
Definitely. There's a song called Scandalized My Name, which some people might know from a really famous Jesse Norman and Kathleen Battle performance at Carnegie Hall. If you don't know that performance, look it up. You'll enjoy. But that song started as a spiritual and kind of a gospel spiritual. And in the album context, Scandalized My Name is Robeson's opportunity to call out his naysayers, kind of an opportunity to speak back towards all of the peoples and powers that have been trying to drag him down. And in my own connection to that, of having been in my own version of, you know, those situations, it was necessary that song continue to shapeshift. One, to change the intensity and mode of communicating that message. One, from an aesthetic that was powerful in the early 20th century, but translating it into an aesthetic that would be understood today as having that same heft of power. So that song on the album starts in a standard sort of way, you know, a standard sort of a gospel spiritual piano, and then transmutes into this world where Robeson is kind of questioning and answering with himself. It goes into an open sort of gospel call and answer situation, which is a more nebulous world of thought, where he's really toying with, you know, who is really after me and what am I trying to say to them? And I come into that as a character. So it's almost like we get to be in dialogue. There's kind of two voices in that section. One where I'm singing more in a Robeson style, and one where I'm singing in a more contemporary gospel style. And then that coalesces into a contemporary sort of gospel song that has a funk element, actually. So it's almost heard a little bit like rock or rock and roll to kind of bring this more contemporary sense of, I'm going to call something out and I'm going to do it with a ferocity of, you know, a bass and drums and electric guitar, and really blow it out to the sort of modern ear's ability to read, I'm going to defend myself.
Wow. And actually, I wanted to mention to you, one of my favorite tracks was Let It Shine. So cool. And I know it has kind of an interesting story for how it started. You mind sharing that quick?
Sure. The pandemic was a really, it goes without definition, just a complex and deep time for everyone in every single way. Part of what it meant for me, though, was a lot of time to be still and reflect. You know, up until that time, I'd been on the road traveling 300 days a year for 10 years. And so I started taking walks at 6 a.m. and really having time to just be simple and reflective. And when you take that time, it's crazy what bubbles up, out of somewhere. And I was living in rural North Carolina with my brother, and this sort of like pulsating beat came to mind with this idea that this song, a version of This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine, was just this thing, this vamp that kept looping. And the idea of a light expanding just meant adding layers to that vamp until it became, one from the most personal whisper to something that would encapsulate the idea of the boundless, the universal. So the arrangement on the album starts, just a simple beat and a solo voice, goes to 2 voices to 3 voices, then adds essentially 24 different tracks of voices with the voices of Harlem Choir and an entire synthesized orchestra, just to show the idea of, something personal and small within oneself can expand to universal scale.
Sure, great. Last question about the album, which is I wonder if you could just talk about the truth.
The truth. So in order to make this project, I formed a band called The Truth. And it was a part of my trying to evolve what a recital could be. Sure. You know, my first recital number 1, Mass, which is a version of which I'm performing here at the festival, is started as voice and piano, but this version is voice and string quartet. So, you know, continuing to expand that idea. And then to move to Robeson, which is essentially my recital number 2, I thought, you know, how can I expand the sound world even more? And so I found this incredible pianist, John Bittoy, through mutual friends, who's a part of the, grew up as a Rachmaninoff prodigy and also now is a part of the Chicago jazz scene and has his own jazz club in Chicago. So just somebody that can play the facility of, you know, the most thorny, you know, classical and contemporary works, but has the freedom of range of a first-rate improviser is the most inspiring colleague to work with because you can go literally anywhere. And then through another colleague in workshop, I found the contemporary R&B artist and electric bass player and sound artist Kari Lucas, who is a genius in his own right in being able to take sound and shape it into, you know, I guess feelings and aesthetics and environments that are just from other places, you know, so like literally expanding the sound world. And between the two of them, I've been able to really dream up any plethora of modes of expression. You know, there's John on one end who is almost a spastic energy able to generate so many different ideas. And then there's Kari on the other end who is very, very grounded and looks at things in a measured way, but also tries to bring out deeper meaning. So in terms of, you know, an instrument of a band in order to realize things, I feel really blessed to have found a combination of colleagues that can help me realize the truth of various musical endeavors.
Yeah. Wow. Cool. It's coolly well connected and interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit about the concert you're doing with us. So you're here with the festival presenting a program devised with the Dover Quartet. Can you, just to wrap things up, talk a little bit about that program and its inspiration?
Yeah. This is an iteration of the recital program I first came up with for Carnegie Hall maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I spent a long time trying to think of what this program would be. You know, it was maybe a 2 or 3 year journey to think, okay, what does it mean to do a debut recital? And taking that idea, debut recital, in a very, I guess, pedantic way, you know, it's the first formal artistic statement that a singer makes, you know, in a sort of older school way of thinking about it. And I thought, okay, if I'm making a first statement, it should be about where I've come from, you know, to introduce myself through my my actual, you know, life narrative. And in thinking about all the early musics that brought me to where I was at that point, it had all been liturgical. You know, I talked about rural Northern Virginia and growing up in the Black Baptist Church, but I also sang Renaissance, you know, music at Harvard that is sacred and from a different tradition. I sang at the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. while I was an arts administrator freelance. And then I also sang with the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in New York. So a lot of different ways into liturgy from a lot of different cultures. And that naturally led me to the curiosity of trying to understand, how do these things relate? You know, they're all different religions, different ways that are getting what I found the same things, which is just trying to provide ways for people to deal with problems. You know, how do humans engage what's going on in our lives in a deep way, and how do you find solutions? So, like, yes, that can be thought of as religious or dogmatic, but it can also be thought of as just simply human. You know, just different metaphors that try to tackle that. So this Mass program uses the Catholic Mass as a structure, you know, simply a backbone of a human story. So long story short, you know, a Kyrie can be thought of, you know, asking for help. An Agnus Dei, you know, Lamb of God, that can also be thought of, well, change or sacrifice, meaning like what needs to change in order to find the solution to a problem. Or credo, meaning believe, means like you have belief that the problem can change, and so on. So I asked Carolyn Shaw, the composer, to write a miniature mass, all a cappella, all short movements less than a minute, to serve as a structure into which musics from different cultures were inserted. So there's music from Baroque tradition, there's Handel, there's also Bach, there's music from the gospel church, and there's also contemporary music written by Black composers, just to show that all of these different times and all of these different aesthetics and voices have something very important to say about the simple human journey of dealing with problems and deciding to go on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wow, great. So Davóne is with us for a concert with the Dover Quartet on August 9th at the First Presbyterian Church of Skaneateles, New York. His album Robeson will release on September 13th, 2024. Learn more about the Skaneateles Festival events and buy tickets at www.skanfest.org. And we will catch you on the next one.